This is chapter 16 of Anglo-Saxon Boy, and is called Cunning Old Wolf. It turned out to be easier than he had thought. The next day, Hardrada decided to take Tostig hunting in the mountains. "We need some sport, after so much talking," he said, slapping Tostig on the back. Magnus and Hakon stood at the doorway of the hall, watching them ride off. Hardrada on a magnificent white stallion, Tostig behind him on a shaggy pony, a dozen of Hardrada's bodyguard following. "Round up the men, Hakon," said Magnus. "We leave on the next tide." "So soon?" said Hakon. "Tostig will guess that he has been deceived." Magnus shrugged. At least Hakon hadn't used the word betrayed. "It's too late to worry about that. I need to tell my father what I know as quickly as possible." They left later that morning on an ebb tide, Hakon steering them out to sea, the oars beating the cold grey waves. Several of Hardrada's men watching and pointing from the wharves. One of them turned and ran back towards Hardrada's hall. "I have a feeling Hardrada might send a ship or two after us," said Hakon, frowning as he gripped the steerboard. "We'd better make sure we won't be easy to follow." That meant striking out across the open sea instead of following the coast, as most voyagers did. Such a route would be quicker, but more dangerous, although Magnus was confident enough in Hakon's ability as a seafarer to get them safely back to England. The journey took 5 days, 4 days of sunshine and calm, and one of wild weather, the ship battered by a gale. It was early evening as they rode at last up the Thames, the sun setting like a ball of blood and fire beyond Thorney Island. Magnus and Hakon jumped off the ship as soon as its side touched the wharf and went to find the king. Things had changed on Thorney in the time they had been away. There were many more housecarls than usual on the island, more than Magnus had ever seen in one place. A dozen burly smiths were working on weapons of war in a big new smithy, their hammers ringing on the just-forged red-hot blades of swords and axes and spears. The king was in his audience chamber, talking to Archbishop Stigand and several other men, including Magnus's uncles, Gurth and Leofwine, all of them grim-faced. "It's good to see you, Magnus," said his father. "We will speak in private." He led Magnus to a private chamber where Magnus told him everything that he had found out over the summer. His father listened carefully, only interrupting to ask a couple of questions. Eventually Magnus fell silent. "You did well, Magnus, even if the news you bring me is bad," he said. "I know William plans to invade. He sent an envoy to tell me that a few days ago. He is a generous lord and says that he will spare my life and the lives of my family if I give him the crown. But I thought Hardrada might be too old for such an adventure. Now, thanks to my golden-tongued brother, I will have to face 2 armies." "Did you really swear that oath to Duke William?" said Magnus. His father frowned. "I had no choice," he said. "I had fallen into his hands, and I knew I would never leave Normandy alive unless I did what he wanted. And a forced oath isn't binding, Magnus, whatever William might say. Don't forget, King Edward named me as his successor on his deathbed." He talked on, going over and over the reasons why his claim to the throne was better than anyone else's, and Magnus realised his father had changed too. He seemed burdened by all that was happening, taut as a stretched bowstring, angry with the enemies who were gathering around him. Something else nagged at Magnus, and he suddenly realised what it was. His father looked more like Tostig now. "What are we going to do?" said Magnus when his father paused. "2 things," said his father. "The first is that we prepare for war. I've called all my housecarls together and we are raising the third. That's what I was talking to Stigand and your uncles about. The heralds have been sent to every shire." Magnus knew about the third. It was the name given to the army of peasants the king could summon to protect his realm, ordinary men who would leave their farms to take part in one campaign, usually with only a spear and an old shield and a leather helmet. They would never be warriors like the housecarls, but they could fill out a shield wall, and they would fight hard to protect their homes from invaders. "And what is the other thing, father?" said Magnus. His father shrugged. "We wait," he said. It was late summer when Magnus returned to England, the month of August, and that soon turned into a bright September, the days still warm, the evenings cool. He slipped back into his thorny routine of guard duty and training, but there was more of an edge to it now, all of them aware that something big was about to happen. Then one day, halfway through the month, a messenger arrived from the north, Magnus was with his father in the great hall when the man strode in, his boots ringing on the stone floor. The hall was as crowded as always, although these days there were usually more warriors and chainmail present than priests. All eyes turned to the messenger as he knelt before the king and bowed his head. "My lord, I have been sent by Edwin and Morcar with evil tidings," he said. "The King of Norway has landed on the coast of Northumbria with a great army." A buzz of conversation immediately filled the hall, and some men swore and yelled curses, calling Hardrada all the names they could think of. Magnus looked at his father, who sat motionless on his throne, deep in thought. "So it begins," Harold murmured. Then he stood up abruptly and marched out of the hall, beckoning to the messenger to follow. "Magnus, fetch your uncles," he said. "If we are to go to war, to go on the war trail, we need a plan." They gathered in the room his father had used before he had taken the crown, and Magnus soon realised why. The best maps of the kingdom were kept there, and his father ordered the scribes to lay them out on the table. Now a group of men stood around it. His father and the messengers, Magnus's uncles, his brothers, Godwin and Edmund, Stigand. Magnus was by his father's side, Hakon behind them. His father asked the messenger where Hardrada had landed. The man pointed on the map to the coast just north of where the great river Humber met the sea. "Are you sure it's an army?" said Gurth. "This might be no more than a raid." "It's an army," said the messenger. "I didn't see them land myself. It was the coast warden who sent the news, but he said there were at least 700 ships. The faces round the table grew even more grim. "That's a lot of warriors," said Leofwine. "Even with only 30 to a ship, that could be as many as 20,000, said Magnus's father. "But not every ship would have been full of warriors. They'll need room for horses and supplies as well." "Even so, Harold," murmured Gurth. "We weren't expecting so many." Magnus's father ignored him and turned to the messenger again. "Do you know where the army is now?" he asked. "Which direction did Hardrada take?" "I left the morning after he landed. That was 12 days ago," said the man. "All I know is that he set off inland, heading west. They could be anywhere." "He's making for York," said Magnus, speaking as the thought formed in his mind, and everyone looked at him. "Hardrada would have landed further south if he had wanted to attack us immediately. Perhaps he thinks the Danes in the north will flock to his banner, and he can take the rest of the kingdom afterwards. Besides, Tostig wants his earldom back." "Wise words, my son," said his father. "The question is, what should I do about it? Should I just wait till Hardrada rides up to the gates of Thorney?" Magnus looked down at the map and thought for a moment. "That's what he wants you to do," he said. "He thinks you'll stay here in case William invades." "I agree," said his father. "Hardrada is a cunning old wolf. He'll stay in the north while we English and Normans slaughter each other down here, and he'll swoop, gobble up whoever is still standing. So we will do the opposite of what he expects. We will go to the north and give him the biggest surprise of his life." Then he started giving orders, and within the hour Thorney Island was a whirl of activity, housecarls rushing to prepare for the long ride to the north. Horses were saddled, weapons and armour were packed on spare mounts, the column assembled. 3 hours after the messenger had first arrived, they were ready to leave. They clattered out of Thorney over the bridge, Magnus riding just behind his father, Hakon beside him. Magnus glanced back at the men following, a giant silver serpent of chainmail warriors riding in pairs beneath the golden autumn sun. Then he turned round and spurred his horse forward.